Once, there was a billionaire named Richard Harper, a man who seemed untouchable in every way. He lived in a world full of luxury, where his private jets, sprawling mansions, and expensive cars were just a part of his daily life. Richard had worked hard, but over the years, his success had turned him arrogant, and he began to look down on everyone around him, including his employees, his friends, and even his own family. He believed money was the only measure of a person's worth, and he never imagined life could take away everything he had. Every morning, Richard would wake up in his enormous penthouse overlooking the city, sipping his finest coffee, while his staff hurried to fulfill his every wish. His days were filled with meetings about billion-dollar deals, investments, and strategies to increase his already massive wealth. To him, nothing mattered except power, status, and money. He had built a life where appearances were everything, and emotions or relationships were secondary. But life has a way of humbling even the most powerful. One day, a series of bad business decisions, hidden debts, and risky investments came crashing down on Richard. His companies began losing millions, creditors started calling, and investors pulled out. Panic replaced his confidence, and Richard realized that he had underestimated the fragility of his empire. The man who once controlled everything suddenly found himself powerless, and the shock hit him like a wave. Richard tried to fight back, calling lawyers, attempting to sell assets, and pleading with his partners, but nothing worked. The news spread quickly. Richard Harper, the billionaire who had seemed untouchable, had lost everything. The headlines were brutal, and the whispers of people who once admired him now carried mockery and disbelief. Friends who were around for his wealth disappeared, and even family members began questioning their support. He felt alone for the first time in his life. As the days passed, Richard's luxurious penthouse felt empty and cold. The silence was unbearable, and he began to realize that all his wealth had never brought him true happiness or real friends. His life, which had been so full of pride, was now reduced to memories and regrets. Each room reminded him of what he had lost, and the world outside seemed indifferent to his fall. He wandered through the streets, seeing people living simple lives, working hard, laughing, and helping each other, and for the first time, Richard felt a strange emptiness inside, a longing he had never felt before. Even his pride, which had once been unshakable, began to crumble. He tried to maintain a brave face, but inside, fear and despair took over. The billionaire who had once been surrounded by power and influence now faced rejection, humiliation, and the harsh reality of starting over with nothing. His mind raced with questions. How did this happen? Did I waste my life chasing money and ignoring people who truly cared? Every answer brought more guilt and sorrow. Richard's fall was not just financial, it was personal. He had lost respect, reputation, and the sense of control he once had over his life. He realized that he had built his empire on fragile foundations, trusting only numbers and not human connections. His arrogance had blinded him to the small acts of loyalty and love around him, and now he was paying the price. One rainy evening, Richard sat alone in a small, empty apartment he could barely afford, looking out of the window at the city he once ruled. He reflected on everything. The man who had thought himself invincible now understood the fragility of life. The luxurious world he had taken for granted had vanished in a blink, leaving him with nothing but lessons he was forced to learn the hard way. And it was in this moment of despair, this deep pit of loss and loneliness, that life prepared to surprise him. In the midst of his fall, a tiny spark of hope was waiting, someone who would enter his life and change it in ways he could never imagine. But at this moment, Richard could not see it. He could only feel the weight of everything he had lost. He was broken, humbled, and alone, yet unknowingly, his journey toward true transformation was about to begin. After losing everything, Richard Harper's life turned upside down. The once powerful billionaire, who had been the center of attention wherever he went, now found himself invisible in the eyes of the world. No business meetings, no luxury cars, no lavish parties, just silence and the cold reality of life without wealth. At first, Richard tried to hold on to his old pride, convincing himself that his empire could be rebuilt quickly, but every attempt only reminded him of how far he had fallen. He rented a small apartment in a quiet part of the city, far away from the skyscrapers and penthouses that had once defined his life. The apartment was simple, with barely enough furniture, and the neighbors were ordinary people, living ordinary lives. They didn't know who he was, and Richard, for the first time, had to live among people without the privilege his money had once guaranteed. Each day, he walked the streets, Feeling the judgment of his own conscience more than anyone else's, he saw families laughing, children playing, and shopkeepers greeting customers, and a strange feeling of emptiness washed over him. He had spent decades chasing wealth and power, but he had never experienced the simple joys of life. Richard's pride, which had once been unshakable, now became his enemy. He found it difficult to ask for help, even when he was hungry or needed money for rent. His ego, which had driven him to become a billionaire, now trapped him in loneliness. He remembered the people he had ignored, the employees he had mistreated, and the friends he had used for personal gain. Regret became a constant companion, and it weighed heavily on his heart. At work, he tried to rebuild his connections, but doors were closed everywhere. People who had once called him a genius now avoided him, afraid of being associated with failure. Even old colleagues, who had shared deals and dinners with him, now acted like strangers. Richard realized that money had been the only bridge connecting him to others, and without it, he was alone. The lessons were harsh, but they were necessary, forcing him to look deep within himself and see the man he had become. Richard started doing odd jobs to survive, from consulting small businesses to helping in local stores. Each task was humbling, and each interaction taught him something new. He saw honesty, hard work, and kindness in ways he had never appreciated before. Even though life was difficult, a slow change began inside him. He started noticing the smiles of people who had nothing to give but shared warmth, and for the first time, he felt a strange sense of connection. Loneliness was still a heavy burden, and there were nights when Richard sat alone in his small apartment, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he would ever regain what he had lost. But amidst the despair, small sparks of hope began to appear. He realized that wealth could never replace trust, love, and respect. He began to write down his thoughts, reflecting on his past mistakes and dreaming of a life that could be meaningful, not just rich. It was during this time that he noticed a young girl who often passed by his apartment. She was the daughter of the maid who had once worked in his mansion. She was smart, confident, and had a kindness in her eyes that Richard had rarely seen in people he called friends. There was something about her, a sense of wisdom beyond her years, that made him pause. He started noticing her small acts of care toward others, how she helped people without expecting anything in return, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt drawn to her. Richard knew deep inside that this girl could change more than just his day. She could change the way he saw the world. But at this point, he was still broken and unsure. Still, a tiny flicker of hope glimmered in his heart. The billionaire who had lost everything was beginning to understand that life was no longer about money. It was about learning, growing, and finding unexpected allies in the most unlikely people. And he didn't yet realize that his greatest transformation was about to begin. The maid's daughter, whose name was Amara, lived a life far different from Richard Harper's former world. She was only 23, but her presence was already commanding, not through wealth or power, but through intelligence, kindness, and a quiet strength that drew people toward her. Amara had grown up in a modest home, helping her mother with housework and learning the values of hard work, empathy, and resilience. She had seen life's hardships, yet she never let them dull her spirit or her ability to care for others. Amara had once worked in Richard's mansion as a child, helping her mother with cleaning, organizing, and running small errands. Even then, she had noticed the arrogance of the billionaire, how he looked at people as tools for his success. But unlike many, Amara didn't feel fear or resentment. She simply observed, learning lessons about human nature that no classroom could teach. She learned that wealth can blind people to what truly matters, and yet, she also saw moments of loneliness in Richard that most missed. Now, years later, Amara walked the streets with a calm confidence, carrying herself with grace and intelligence. She had grown into a woman who understood the value of small actions, how a kind word or a helping hand could change someone's entire day. One rainy afternoon, she noticed a man sitting on the steps of a nearly empty building. His expensive suit, now worn and dirty, gave a glimpse of a life he once had, and there was a sadness in his eyes that made her heart pause. It was Richard. Though Amara didn't recognize him at first, he looked smaller, vulnerable, and defeated, a stark contrast to the powerful figure she remembered from her childhood. Yet something in his posture, the way he sat quietly, lost in thought, told her that he was more than just a man in trouble. He was a man capable of change, capable of learning, and she felt a strange pull to help him. Amara approached him carefully, her steps soft but deliberate. "Excuse me, sir, are you okay?" she asked, her voice gentle yet confident. Richard looked up, startled. He hadn't been spoken to kindly in weeks, and the warmth in her tone caught him off guard. I'm fine, he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Amara smiled slightly, not pushing, but sitting nearby, letting her presence be comforting. She didn't know yet how deeply she would affect his life, but instinct told her that this man needed guidance. Over the next few days, Amara began noticing him more often, always sitting alone, sometimes wandering the streets, looking lost. She started small, offering a warm cup of tea or sharing her umbrella when rain poured. Her actions were simple, yet they carried a weight of humanity Richard had long forgotten. At first, he resisted, pride still lingering, thinking he didn't need anyone, but slowly, the kindness she showed began to pierce the armor of his ego. He began to feel emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: trust, hope, and a faint spark of gratitude. Amara didn't lecture him, nor did she flaunt her knowledge. She simply shared moments of her life, stories of people who faced hardships yet stayed strong, tales of small victories that carried enormous meaning. Richard listened, sometimes silently, sometimes with curiosity. He felt himself learning from her in ways he never expected. Her perspective was refreshing, honest, and real. Unlike the shallow advice of his former associates, Amara spoke from the heart, and it reached his heart. By the end of the week, Richard began to look forward to these encounters, not just for comfort, but for the insight she offered. He realized that this young woman, who had grown up in modest circumstances, carried wisdom far beyond her years. There was a calm certainty in her, a knowledge that life's true value lay not in money or power, but in understanding, empathy, and the courage to act rightly. And for the first time since his fall, Richard felt a flicker of hope. He began to wonder if perhaps life wasn't over for him, if perhaps there was a chance to rebuild, not just his fortune, but his very soul. Amara had no idea how much influence she already held over him, but unknowingly, she was planting the seeds of transformation. Her small acts of kindness, her patience, and her wisdom were slowly reshaping a man who had lost everything, and in the process, she was preparing to change his life in ways he could never imagine. One chilly evening, Richard found himself walking through a quiet park, the autumn leaves crunching beneath his feet. He had no particular destination, just a restless mind and a heavy heart. The city around him bustled with life, but he felt detached, as if he were invisible to the world. Lost in thought, he almost didn't notice Amara sitting on a bench, her notebook in hand, writing quietly. There was something about her presence that drew him in, a calm confidence that seemed to cut through his fog of despair. Amara looked up and noticed him. She didn't speak immediately, but her eyes held a mix of recognition and concern. She had seen this man wandering aimlessly for days, and now she sensed he had reached a point where he could no longer hide from reality. "Richard, you seem troubled," she said gently, her voice breaking through his mental walls. He froze, surprised that she knew his name, and even more surprised that she spoke to him without judgment. I am fine," he stammered, but he felt the weight of the lie even as he said it. Amara didn't push. She closed her notebook and motioned for him to sit. "Sometimes, being fine isn't the truth, and admitting it is the first step to finding real solutions," she said calmly. Richard hesitated, unsure why this young woman, the daughter of someone he barely remembered, seemed to understand him better than anyone else had in months, but something in her tone made him sit. He realized that he had been carrying his pride like a heavy coat, and for the first time, he was willing to set it down. They spoke for hours, not about money or past mistakes, but about life, choices, and resilience. Amara shared stories of people who had faced hardships yet found unexpected paths to success, stories of compassion and courage that Richard had never considered valuable. He listened, fascinated by her insight, and slowly, a shift began within him. He realized that his life had been focused on accumulating wealth, while neglecting the qualities that truly mattered: kindness, integrity, and connection. At one point, Richard admitted something he had never allowed himself to say aloud. "I feel like I've wasted so much of my life chasing things that don't matter," he said, his voice shaky. Amara nodded, encouraging him without criticism. "It's never too late to change, Richard, but first, you have to see the value in the small, meaningful actions around you," she replied. Her words struck him deeply, planting a seed of understanding that would grow rapidly in the coming days. Amara didn't just talk, she acted. she showed him how small choices could lead to big changes. They walked through the park, and she pointed out acts of kindness, people helping strangers, children sharing their toys, neighbors supporting each other in quiet ways. Richard observed, slowly realizing that life was happening all around him, and he had been blind to it. His perspective began to shift, and he felt the first stirrings of hope since his fall. Then, without warning, a sudden incident tested Richard's newfound openness. A young boy ran into the street chasing a ball, and a car came speeding toward him. Richard froze, panic gripping him, but Amara reacted instantly, grabbing the boy and pulling him to safety. The moment lasted seconds, but it left an indelible mark on Richard. He saw bravery, quick thinking, and selflessness embodied in a single person, and it stunned him. For the first time, Richard realized that wealth and power could never replace courage, kindness, or wisdom. In that single moment, he understood that Amara was not just a helper or a guide, she was a catalyst for change. The girl he had once overlooked had just shown him the true meaning of influence, and he felt both humbled and inspired. As they sat together afterward, catching their breath, Richard looked at her with a mixture of awe and gratitude. "I don't know how you do it," he said quietly. "I can teach business, money, and power, but I've never understood life like this." Amara smiled. "Sometimes, life doesn't teach through money or status, Richard, it teaches through moments, actions, and the people who care enough to guide you when you're lost," she said. And at that moment, Richard Harper knew that his life was about to change forever. He had lost everything, yet in seconds, through the courage and wisdom of one young woman, he had glimpsed a path back to hope, redemption, and true transformation. After that life-changing moment in the park, Richard began to see the world differently. For the first time, he realized that his wealth had never taught him courage, kindness, or true purpose, but now, with Amara's guidance, he began to understand that transformation wasn't instant. It was a journey. She didn't lecture him about mistakes or failures. Instead, she focused on small, practical steps that could rebuild his life from the inside out. Amara suggested that Richard start by helping people around him in small ways. "Start where you are, with what you have, and the rest will follow," she told him. At first, Richard felt unsure, hesitant to step into a world where money and influence didn't provide an automatic solution, but Amara patiently guided him, showing that even small acts, helping a struggling shopkeeper, offering advice to a young entrepreneur, or volunteering at a local shelter, could spark real change. Richard began noticing things he had ignored for decades. He saw the struggles of ordinary people and the resilience they carried. Their determination and humility inspired him more than any boardroom or stock market victory ever had. Slowly, he began to feel a connection to the world outside his former bubble of wealth, and that connection ignited a fire inside him he had thought was long extinguished. Amara also taught him to reflect on his own life. "You need to face your mistakes to understand who you are now," she said. They spent evenings discussing his past choices, the arrogance that had blinded him, and the relationships he had neglected. At first, it was painful for Richard to confront the truth, but Amara's gentle words made it easier. She helped him see that failure was not shameful, it was a chance to learn, grow, and rebuild stronger. One day, she challenged him to face a situation that mirrored his past arrogance. A young business owner was struggling with a failed investment and approached Richard for advice. Previously, he might have ignored or dismissed the person, but now, Richard listened, offered guidance, and shared insights honestly, without expecting anything in return. The gratitude in the young entrepreneur's eyes reminded Richard of the power of humility and genuine human connection. Through these experiences, Richard began to rebuild not only his confidence but his character. He realized that his previous life had been hollow because it lacked purpose, empathy, and authenticity. Amara encouraged him to embrace mistakes as lessons, setbacks as opportunities, and relationships as treasures more valuable than any bank account. Every day with her guidance added a layer of wisdom, patience, and compassion he had never known. Richard also started reconnecting with people he had wronged in the past. Apologies were difficult, pride still tried to interfere, but with Amara's encouragement, he learned that vulnerability was not weakness, it was strength. People who had once distanced themselves slowly began to notice the change, seeing a man who was sincere, humble, and willing to grow, and they responded with trust and warmth. Through small steps, Richard began to regain a sense of purpose, but the most profound change was internal. He no longer measured his worth by wealth or power, he measured it by actions, by kindness, and by the positive impact he could have on the lives of others. Amara's quiet guidance, her wisdom, and her unwavering belief in him became the compass that directed his life. One evening, as they walked together, Richard paused and looked at her, awe and gratitude in his eyes. "I never thought a single person could change my life so completely," he said. Amara smiled softly. "It's not just me, Richard, it's your willingness to learn, to listen, and to act that makes the difference. Change comes from within, but sometimes, someone just needs to show you the way," she said. By now, Richard understood the truth in her words. He had lost everything, yet he had gained something far more valuable, a chance to rebuild his life with meaning, empathy, and purpose. Through Amara's guidance, he was not just recovering his confidence, he was becoming a better man, ready to face the world with humility and courage, ready to transform not only his life but the lives of others around him. Richard had been learning, reflecting, and growing for weeks, but he still carried the weight of past failures and the fear of the future. He had started rebuilding his life, gaining confidence and humility, but deep down, he wondered if he could ever truly rise again. One ordinary afternoon, that question was about to be answered in a way he could never have imagined. It happened in the city square, a place he had once overlooked, thinking it beneath him. On that day, a major fire broke out in a nearby building, smoke rising high and people screaming in panic. Richard froze at first, unsure what to do. His old instincts to watch and wait for someone else to act surfaced, but then he saw Amara running toward the chaos, her face focused and calm, as if she already knew what had to be done. Without thinking, Richard followed her, adrenaline pushing him past fear. They reached the building just as flames began to trap a small group of people on the upper floors. Amara quickly organized a small crowd to help, instructing them to form a human chain, grab ladders, and clear paths for escape. Richard, stunned by her bravery, felt a surge of determination. The girl he had been learning from was now showing him, in action, what courage really meant. Amara spotted a young child trapped in a corner, terrified and crying. She pointed to Richard and said, "Go. You can help him, I'll guide the others." In that instant, Richard didn't hesitate. He ran through the smoke and heat, reaching the boy, who clung to him in fear. The flames crackled around them, and Richard felt the raw danger for the first time in his life. Yet, he didn't falter, because Amara had taught him to trust himself and act with purpose. With careful steps, Richard carried the child down a narrow staircase, remembering the lessons of patience and observation Amara had shared. Each step felt like a test, but the gratitude and trust in the child's eyes fueled his courage. Meanwhile, Amara coordinated the rescue of everyone else, moving with precision and calm authority. She was not just guiding him, she was inspiring him, showing him that real strength came from action, not status or money. When they finally emerged from the building, everyone safe, Richard felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The city crowd cheered, but it was Amara's calm smile that struck him the most. She had not only saved lives but had given him a chance to act heroically, something he had never done before in a meaningful way. In that single, chaotic moment, Richard understood that his past failures and losses had prepared him to finally rise, not as a businessman or billionaire, but as a human being capable of courage, empathy, and leadership. That day changed everything. In seconds, his perspective shifted. The billionaire who had once measured life by money and power now realized that true wealth was measured by courage, action, and the ability to positively affect others. Amara had guided him, taught him, and now, in this life-or-death moment, she had transformed him completely. The lessons she had shared over weeks became real, tangible, and unforgettable. As they stood outside the building, watching the firefighters handle the remaining flames, Richard looked at Amara with deep respect and gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice trembling. She shook her head. "You don't need to thank me, Richard, you only needed to see it for yourself, to realize that you are capable of more than you ever imagined." Her words resonated within him, echoing the truth he had been learning quietly. From that day on, Richard knew his life would never be the same. The fire had tested him, challenged him, and in just a few moments, it had transformed his path. He had learned courage, selflessness, and the true value of human connection, all because one young woman, Amara, had believed in him, guided him, and placed him in a situation where he could discover the hero within himself. After the fire, Richard Harper felt like a new man. He had seen courage, selflessness, and purpose in action, and it had awakened something inside him that money and power never could. The experience had not only tested him but had shown him what truly mattered in life. From that moment on, he was determined to rebuild, not just his fortune, but the man he wanted to become. Richard began by reconnecting with people he had neglected. He visited old friends, not to ask for favors or show off wealth, but to apologize sincerely, to express gratitude, and to rebuild trust. Many were skeptical at first, unsure if his change was real, but his humility and consistent actions gradually broke down their doubts. He learned the importance of patience, listening, and understanding, qualities he had ignored when he was at the height of his success. He also focused on helping others in tangible ways. With Amara by his side, he started small initiatives in the city, providing support for struggling families, mentoring young entrepreneurs, and funding community programs. Unlike his past generosity, which had been about recognition, these efforts were selfless. Richard discovered that real satisfaction came from seeing people grow and succeed, and from making a positive difference in their lives. Amara continued to guide him, but now their relationship had evolved into a partnership of mutual respect. She encouraged him to face challenges directly, to act with integrity, and to make decisions not for profit, but for people. Richard listened, learned, and applied her wisdom, slowly transforming into a leader who inspired rather than commanded. His confidence grew, not from fear or power, but from competence, empathy, and authenticity. Over time, Richard even rebuilt some of his financial ventures, but this time, he approached business differently. He invested in projects that created value for communities, supported ethical practices, and prioritized sustainability. Success returned to him, but unlike before, it was accompanied by purpose and meaning. He had learned that true wealth was not measured in dollars, but in the impact he had on others and the legacy he created. Perhaps the most important transformation was internal. Richard no longer feared failure or loss. He had faced his worst moments and survived, learning that resilience, humility, and compassion were stronger than money or status. Every action he took now reflected his growth, and he felt a sense of peace and fulfillment that he had never experienced in his luxurious past. One afternoon, Richard invited Amara to his office, a place that was no longer a symbol of arrogance, but of responsibility and vision. "I owe you more than I can ever express," he said, looking at her with genuine gratitude. "You didn't just guide me, you helped me become someone I can be proud of." Amara smiled. "I only showed you the way, Richard, you walked it yourself," she replied. Her words reminded him that transformation is never about a single act, but a journey of learning, courage, and reflection. As they looked out over the city together, Richard realized how much he had changed. The man who had once measured life by money and power had become someone who understood its true meaning. He had learned to value kindness, empathy, courage, and human connection. The lessons Amara had taught him would stay with him forever, shaping not only his actions but his heart. Richard Harper had lost everything, yet in losing it, he had gained something far greater. Through guidance, experience, and his own willingness to change, he had become a better man, ready to live a life of purpose, integrity, and impact. And he knew, without a doubt, that none of this would have been possible without the young woman who had transformed his life in seconds, the maid's daughter who had become his greatest teacher, friend, and inspiration. Richard Harper had come a long way from the man who had lost everything. The fire, the fall of his empire, and the guidance of Amara had changed him in ways he could never have imagined. He now understood that life's true value was measured not by wealth or status, but by courage, empathy, and the positive impact one had on others. Every step he had taken since his lowest point had shaped him into a man he could finally be proud of. With Amara by his side, Richard began expanding his efforts to help the community on a larger scale. He established programs to educate underprivileged children, provide support for struggling families, and mentor young professionals who lacked guidance. Unlike his past ventures, these projects were not about profit or recognition. They were about creating lasting change, about giving others the opportunities he had once taken for granted. The city began to notice the transformation, not just of Richard Harper, but of the lives around him. Richard also rebuilt personal relationships that had been strained or broken. He reached out to family members he had ignored, offering heartfelt apologies and taking steps to repair the damage. Friends who had once doubted his sincerity now saw the genuine man he had become, and they returned to support him. The billionaire who had once relied solely on power now relied on honesty, kindness, and trust. And the results were more rewarding than any financial success could ever be. Amara watched all of this quietly, never seeking praise, but always guiding him when needed. Her patience, wisdom, and unwavering belief in his potential had been the catalyst for his transformation. Richard often reflected on the journey and realized that her influence had gone far beyond teaching him lessons. She had helped him discover the best version of himself, a version that was capable of love, compassion, and meaningful action. One morning, Richard visited a small orphanage he had funded, and as he walked through the rooms, children ran to greet him, their laughter filling the air. He knelt down to speak with a little girl who reminded him of Amara as a child, and he felt a wave of gratitude. The life he had lost and the hardships he had endured had prepared him to appreciate moments like this, to truly understand what mattered in life. It was no longer about being rich or powerful, it was about making a difference. And he felt fulfilled in a way he never had before. Richard realized that Amara's lessons were not just about helping him change his actions, they were about changing his perspective. His life had been saved from despair because someone believed in his potential, and now he was determined to carry that forward, to be the guiding hand for others who were lost or struggling. His experience had become a blueprint for transformation, showing that even the deepest fall could lead to the highest growth if met with courage, humility, and guidance. In the evenings, Richard often met Amara in the park where it all had begun. They would talk about progress, plans, and the people whose lives they could touch next. But now, there was no longer a teacher-student relationship, it was a partnership built on mutual respect, admiration, and shared purpose. Richard often marveled at how a single person, with compassion and courage, had transformed his life in seconds, and how that transformation had continued to ripple outward, changing countless lives beyond his own. Richard Harper, the man who had once lost everything, had finally found himself. He had gained wisdom, humility, purpose, and the ability to create lasting change. His story became an inspiration for the city, a reminder that no matter how far one falls, redemption is possible, and true greatness comes from the heart, not the bank account. As he stood with Amara, watching the sunset over the city they were helping to rebuild, Richard knew that his journey had reached a new beginning, not an end. And that the power of one person's courage, kindness, and belief could indeed change a life forever.